Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Certainly going to go down in history as one of the biggest flops for Marvel, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the Walt Disney Company. But more importantly are the lasting impacts that movie had on this weekend's opening of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. One of the big questions is how long will this impact last? Because the next movie up after Guardians is The Marvels, all the way out in November. No big expectations for that film's box office at this point, for sure. But the question we need to answer today is how much did the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios lose on Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania? And does the MCU as a whole in 2023 have any chance at box office profitability at this point? Let's get into it. Renegade Online. Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that notification bell, hit that like button, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 opened to a rather quiet and somber $118 million in its first frame, its initial weekend on May 5th. And to give folks an idea of just where that lands in the history of Marvel films, which opened up the summer season, this Guardians of the Galaxy movie is about the worst. And yes, as hard as it is for some people to realize when they look at a $118 million opening weekend at the domestic box office and have to come to grips with the fact that, wow, that's actually bad. Yes, it is. For a movie with a $250+ million production budget that I think is probably going to wind up being closer to $300 million once the actual figures get published at some point down the road, not to mention a $150 million estimated marketing spend at this point. It's a movie that's got to get to around $800 million at the global box office just to hit a break-even point. And as it stands right now, even overperforming a bit from its very weak projections coming into its opening weekend, at $289 million, this movie basically has to run the tables to a 3x set of legs from its global open just to reach that break-even point comfortably. And quite honestly, that is not something that Disney Marvel distributed films typically do. In fact, the average, as we've discussed before in phases 4 and 5, have floated in closer to the 2.5 set of legs. That would put the final box office run of this movie somewhere around $700 million if it's lucky enough to get up to that point. If it underperforms that 2.5x, which I think there's a decent chance at this point it will, only time will tell, specifically the second weekend at the box office for this film, it's probably still going to land somewhere in that 650 to maybe as high as 700 million range. If you recall from one of the first videos we did, it felt like 650 million coming into opening weekend, based on projections, is where this movie was probably going to wind up. And a lot of folks really liked the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I was among them. Even though it wasn't what I expected, I thought the film delivered something different and interesting, and it probably was the best entry of the Disney-distributed Marvel films in phases 4 and 5. Of course, as I continue to remind people, Spider-Man No Way Home is a Sony-distributed film. Now, while the story was its own, the box office was absolutely, unequivocally hindered by the terrible performances of movies that have come before it, namely in the case of the one that came immediately before Guardians of the Galaxy 3, and that was Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania launched its opening weekend with about $106 million in the domestic box office, only about $12 million less than Guardians of the Galaxy, which is stunning to me because Guardians of the Galaxy historically was always far better received than the Ant-Man films were, at least financially at the box office. The Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania box office, however, finished only at $213 million, just shy of $214 as a matter of fact. Only about a 2x set of legs from its opening weekend, and the worldwide box office completed at $465 million. Now, certainly another couple of $1 million may trickle in over the next few weeks as the movie finally works its way out of theaters across the globe, but there's not going to be any significant change at this point. But with a movie with a listed production budget of $200 million, and again, that does not include reshoots that happened early this year, just about a month before the film opened, reshooting, according to some reports, the entire ending or maybe even significant parts of the third act. That final spend on Ant-Man and the Wasp may wind up being closer to $225 or maybe even $250. That is a lot of last-minute shooting with a lot of last-minute overtime rush jobs on massive amounts of post-production visual effects. And that is a big problem that Marvel seems to keep having over and over again. And as you may recall, on the opening weekend of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, it was also announced that the Marvels was going to be vacating its summer window in July and switching out with The Haunted Mansion, going to November in the Thanksgiving frame because, you guessed it, reshoots. This absolutely plagues big budget movies like this, and that drives the cost through the ceiling and makes profitability even much more difficult to get to. But what we have to understand is the breakdown of how theatrical revenues work based on the gross receipts at the box office. And with current publicly available data from major exhibitioners like AMC Theaters, we know basically what these industry breakdowns are. In the domestic box office on a movie of this scale, about 55% of that domestic revenue gets returned to the distributor. From the international box office, not including China, it's about 40% in this day and age, and a lot of that has gone down a little bit thanks to foreign currency exchange drag, meaning foreign currencies on average are buying fewer US dollars than they were a year or two ago, largely due to inflationary pressures. And then there's China itself, which returns about 25% to the distributor. So if we apply those numbers to what you see on the screen, using $214 million at the domestic box office, that's about $118 million that goes back to Disney. On the international side, removing the $40 million haul from China itself, that puts us at about $212 million in the international retail, and $85 million of that goes back to Disney. China itself, of the $40 million box office, about $10 million returns to Disney. That means that all totaled, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania brought home to the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios somewhere to the tune of $213 million. And that would, of course, not pay for any of the massive marketing campaign that this movie would have engendered. Usually these types of Marvel films, especially big blockbuster films in general, these days tend to command somewhere on the order of close to $150 million in additional expenditures by distributors to actually sell these products to the general public. That would mean that Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, at the very least, lost somewhere in the $125, maybe as high as $150 million range. And that is a boondoggle for the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Studios, and it's one of many that they've had in phases 4 and 5, and that doesn't even count massive problems that have come from other Disney studios like Walt Disney Animation and Pixar with movies like Strange World and Lightyear. It has been one fail after the next, and Guardians of the Galaxy 3 obviously suffered this past weekend from these doldrums. Now, with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania already banking a roughly $125 million loss on the year in 2023, that means that Guardians of the Galaxy 3, if it just scrapes by and breaks even somewhere close to $800 million at the retail level of the box office, Disney's still in the hole for the $125 on the year with Marvel films. And if anybody wants to take bets on what The Marvels starring Brie Larson is going to do in the Thanksgiving frame this year, well, have fun with that. This is a problem that Disney is going to have to address, and I think, if anything, we are going to see in the next few months either official announcements or news leak out from inside that Disney is going to be scaling back these production budgets for these Marvel Cinematic Universe enterprises, and I think everything else that the Walt Disney Company produces for theatrical release and streaming as well. Because the big difference is that in years past, especially Marvel Phases 1 through 3, is that a lot of these movies, even the ones that didn't perform terribly well like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, they had a pretty good shelf life after they exited the theaters. They had big lucrative contracts with third parties like Netflix. They had a lot of premium video on demand sales, rentals, and physical media. That's just not the case anymore because Disney has elected to consume everything onto Disney Plus. And they have basically walked away from billions and billions of dollars of third-party revenue to sacrifice at the altar of the almighty streaming gods. I don't think this is a trend that is financially tenable in the long run, and it's something that they desperately have to address. Quite frankly, the Marvel Cinematic Universe isn't what it was just 3 to 4 years ago. The merchandise sales have also largely tanked as well. Just think of all the Wakanda Forever merchandise that was left sitting on the shelves, and think of all the Captain Marvel and Marvel's toys that will go unsold later this year when those hit store shelves. These are just not things that little girls want to buy, and the boys, by and large, have left the building along with their dads. I think for these reasons, 2023 is going to be the year of the great reckoning inside of the Walt Disney Studio family, and why they're going to have to get their financial house in order, because this simply cannot continue. But please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Love to hear from everybody. Stay tuned because on Wednesday, May 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern, the Walt Disney Company earnings call is upon us, and we'll be covering it live right here on Valiant Renegade. Hope to see you there. Until then, take care.